Okay, all right. Can everyone please find a seat? We'll get the program started in just a few moments. Can everyone please take a seat? Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to tonight's public affairs program. The Union League Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. Our mission is to create more engaged, better educated citizen leaders who share our values. Just added that part, Joan, but it's a good one, right? We do this through a host of programs, including lectures like tonight's public affairs program. I do want to introduce, for those that don't know, the guy who's really responsible for almost all of that programming. He's the chair of our education committee for the Union League Legacy Foundation, Mr. Steve Target. Steve, thank you for all your work. All that we do is made possible through voluntary contributions from Union League members and others that share our values and want us to share them with as many other people as possible. So thank you for your continued support. A few housekeeping items. Before I do that, upcoming programs next week. I hope you've all seen the Frederick Douglass portrait. It's out on Broad Street on the first floor. Next, is that Wednesday the 13th? We have the artist, Jordan Sokol. He'll be here to talk about creating that portrait, his work, and his approach to that great project. So that's the 13th. For all of our programs, please go online. We have a great lineup right up till Thanksgiving. Housekeeping items, please take a moment now to silence your phones if you would. Tonight's program will run about an hour in length in total. It will include a question and answer period that will be moderated by the speaker himself. So we will have microphones that staff will monitor, and just put up your hand. We'll get to as many of the questions as we can. As always, remember, questions should be a couple of sentences, 2, 3, maybe 4. And if you can't put a question mark at the end of it, you have failed. And so please, not a lecture, a question. We want to question our speaker tonight. And now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce the chair of the Legacy Foundation, Joan Carter. Joan.
So good evening. It is truly my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Adam Brandon, who is president of FreedomWorks. If you've been around for a while, you know I do a lot of these introductions, but this one I have a very personal interest in because I actually chair FreedomWorks. So FreedomWorks is the largest grassroots activist organization in the country. We have over 5 million followers in our network. So what is an activist, you ask? I mean, you didn't ask, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Think of it as a political volunteer. It's somebody who believes in what FreedomWorks fights for, which is trying to prevent government from getting ever larger and protecting individual freedom. These are people that put up yard signs, they make phone calls, they text, they send emails. on issues that are important and issues that FreedomWorks is working on. I'll give you a couple examples. So right now, the power of activism. So who are the two most powerful people in this country right now? Joe Biden? No. Donald Trump? No. Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. They are the most powerful people in this world. And right now, FreedomWorks has activists on the ground. We're actually going door to door in both West Virginia and Arizona. The left is trying to move these people. I mean, you probably all read about the woman that followed Kristen Sinema into the bathroom to try to lobby her. But the left is really after them, saying, we will make you pay if you don't support what we support. And we are on the other side. We're FreedomWorks, and we're saying, if you do the right thing, we will have your back. Another example is the Department of Education. So they introduced a bill several months ago to provide funding to teach 1619 in the public schools. You may recall 1619 is a whole program that says that the country was not founded in 1776 on the principles of individual liberty. The country was founded in 1619 on the principle of slavery. Well, we don't think this is right. And even if it were true, it's a terrible idea to be teaching young people. So FreedomWorks did generate over 5,000 comments, and these are emails, these are texts, these are in-person visits to tell representatives, congressmen, senators, and whatever, don't support this. This is not a good thing. And this was in the regulatory field. And the regulators, if they see that there's not a lot of popular support for something, or particularly that there is a real antagonism in the country, they will withdraw it, and they did. And that is the power of activism. So that's FreedomWorks. Now let me tell you a little bit about Adam Brandon, who is our speaker and who is the president of FreedomWorks. He came to FreedomWorks in 2005. He was a press secretary. And I don't want to tell you all of the things that led up to why the position of president became open, but it did. And we were very fortunate. Adam was fortunate. FreedomWorks was fortunate to have the right man in the right place at the right time. Adam has 3 master's degrees. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why anybody has 3 master's degrees, but he does. So he has a degree in political management, economics, and finance from George Washington University, from, I can't even say it, it's a university in Krakow, Poland, and in Georgetown. Adam has a beautiful wife. And you know how people say, well, she's really beautiful, but you know, she's not a rocket scientist. No, she is a rocket scientist. Jacqueline has a PhD in nuclear physics and works for the Nuclear Regulatory Agency in DC. And she's also the mother of their now 8-month-old son. So Adam is here to talk about his book, A Republic, Not a Democracy. And if you haven't read it, I see a lot of you have one for tonight. Please do. It's a really, really interesting book. And for having such profound ideas, he does it in such a conversational way that it's really an easy read and a good read. So I encourage you to do that. Without further ado, Adam Brandon.
I have a theory that if you live long enough in life, you too will work for Joan Carter one day. So here at the Union League, there's, have you seen the painting of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan? So think about that painting. I remember growing up in that era when that happened. And that didn't seem too odd, right? If you go back to the 1980s, like you have a national tragedy, Republicans, Democrats, we can all get together, right? And I think about, I had some uncles and they fought in World War II. I mean, hard fought in World War II. And one of these guys actually lied about his age. And at age 17 years old, he dropped, went airborne over in Europe. And so when I was growing up as a little boy in Northeast Ohio, it always struck me because my father was pretty Republican when I was growing up. My mother was liberal, my father was Republican. I end up libertarian somehow. But these uncles, these guys were hardcore steel-making Union Democrats. But boy, they loved the country. There was no doubt that their pride in the country. And I was thinking about that when when COVID started to hit, when people were talking about all the security, there was no conversation about liberty. And I kept thinking about them and thinking about, because at the time I was writing a book. And I finished my book and it was terrible. It was talking about taxes, it was talking about spending, it was talking all this stuff. And I looked at this book and I was late on my manuscript, of course. And we had to call the publisher and say, we got to start the whole thing over again. Because I was thinking about my uncles that lived in this world, that lived in this America where you could be Republican and Democrat, you could disagree on things, but we all agreed on this common principles and this premise of what the country is and why we're here, that our best days were ahead, they're not behind us, we're not settling old scores. All my family came from Eastern Europe, and one of the things that I was always taught growing up is like that was everything was like left behind there. We are here, to look forward, to build our families. And I just noticed as I'm sitting at home locked down that I noticed that the country, I was kind of losing that in the public debate. And then I just started, there's all this conversation about democracy, and we need to, and I thought about something that happened not too far away from here. I mean, probably one of these streets just around the corner here. When Benjamin Franklin, you know this old story, he was walking away and this woman asked him, "Sir, what kind of government have you given us?" And he's like, "A republic, if you can keep it." And so here we are, hundreds of years later, and I'm putting all this in my head and I'm thinking, this is the exact moment Benjamin Franklin was talking about. You're actually living in it right now. And through all the wars and the Depression and all the other conflicts that you had this set of principles and documents that guided the country through really hard times. The Union League was founded to fight the Civil War, correct? Think of the trauma that the country went through at that time. And think of how many people, and you see banners, it's about the Union, about the Republic. And I think that is very significant. And as you start to move away from those principles, it's kind of like a big, strong wall, and you knock a brick out, and you knock a brick out, and you knock a brick out. At some point, that wall does not stand. And this is, when I speak to like younger audiences, this is something that we just throw around this term democracy so much. And let's pause for a second. Democracy. You go back to ancient Greece. A good friend of mine who I grew up with, and I was this tall, he's actually a Marxist professor, he is, and we get together every year and we talk, and one of the things that he teaches on is Plato's Republic. And he was the one who showed me in Plato's Republic 2,000 years ago. Plato said, before you have a tyranny, you have a pure democracy. I mean, Plato said that. And you fast forward, and that's what actually is at risk. And why? Why is a democracy, because we always say we're a democracy, why is that dangerous? A democracy means majority rules, period. A democracy means that the minority does not have rights. If 51% of people decide you're going to go in a direction, the other 49 have to go. And what gets scary in a democracy is if you look back at history, Adolf Hitler was elected. When you look at history, he did try his coups. He was empowered democratically, and then he basically took the democratic mandate and said, because I'm all powerful, we can do away with all of these things. I'll get to some of my experience in Poland. Poland became a Soviet satellite in 1948. not 1945. During a 3-year period, there was an election. It was the 3S, the Three Talk campaign. And the polls basically voted in their system. So you have to be very careful. The reason the republic is so strong is the republic is your check on all of that. Our system, our founders, I believe what they really understood more than anything else was human nature. This old axiom that absolute power will absolutely corrupt. And I believe that is, when I study history, that always happens. So you set up a system of checks and balances. I always like to illustrate too, you've got the business power in New York checked by the political power in DC. You have the states, you have this whole system set up to check and to check and to check. And it is inconvenient. It is very hard to pass a law in the United States. And I look at that as a strength, not a weakness. And the problem is, as you do away with these protections that you get in a Republican form of government, maybe it'll work. But like, what does history show that happens in this moment? Well, what starts to happen, and hopefully this doesn't sound too familiar, is that people start looking at their government, not like John Kennedy. Remember John Kennedy asked not what you can do for your country, or not what country can do for you, what you can do for your country. That's a republic type of phrase. If it's now, what does my government guarantee me? Does the government guarantee me a job? Does the government guarantee me protection from a virus? Does the government guarantee me higher education? And you go down all these lists, and all of those things are not bad. I'm not anti-higher education. I'm certainly not pro-COVID. But you start going down this list of these things that the government should guarantee for us. Well, we have this balance in the republic between liberty and security. And then you start moving that balance over into security. And eventually liberty gets sacrificed. And that's where I go back to Benjamin Franklin when he said, it's a republic if you can keep it. And I think that there's part, like why have we gotten to this period? Some other interesting things have happened to me. She mentioned my wife, Jacqueline. Jacqueline, I remember the fall of the Berlin Wall. I remember it very well. I was grounded. And the wall started coming down, and my dad opens up my bedroom and he brings in a television set. And remember, rabbit ears, change the channel. And it's the famous image, right? Hammers are out and they're taking the wall down. And he's like, you need to watch this. This is history. You touch that channel, you're a dead man. You watch this. And what's interesting, my wife, who is this brilliant PhD and does math I always make fun of her because her math doesn't even use numbers. It's so advanced. It's like characters. And she has no context of the Berlin Wall falling. None. She knows it happened. Think it happened. She remembers 9/11. That was a moment for her. She was a little girl in school when 9/11 happened. So for her, when you use a phrase like socialism, it really just kind of misses it. Kind of won that Cold War thing, right? It's over. We're moving forward. And I think we've done a bad. And so what you're seeing is we failed to teach civics and history. And when you fail to teach civics and history, this is what you come up with, because someone's going to start to interpret civics and history. And if you could start to reinterpret that the republic was this evil creation, it was designed to keep people down or whatever you want to say it is, and you kind of pull away from it that the republic's not needed, well, then we're just going to move more to a democracy. And if that happens, again, this might work. Maybe we do a great job as a democracy. But what I start playing out, what does an election become? An election becomes, who is going to give me more free things? Who is going to guarantee more of my security? And elections start becoming what is good for the country, what is good for the republic, what is good for, and it just becomes which candidate's given me more. And one place that I look at in the past that you had something similar happen was Argentina. In 1945, Argentina was like one of the top 5 richest countries in the world. And even before the World War II, Argentina had the right demographic mixes. It had a young growing population. It had all the resources it needs. It has water, it has food. I mean, Argentina today should be a wealthy nation like Britain or France when you talk about it. But what happened? Well, you have this guy Perón, and what did Perón do? He starts guaranteeing everything. And you talk to someone from Argentina, they tell this story. He starts talking about free school and free healthcare and free this and free that and free this. And next thing you know, the ad economy tanks. It becomes very inward looking, because if you lose that growth, now what you're trying to do is just redistribute parts of the pie. You're not growing the pie anymore. And if you think about what that would mean for our country, it becomes pretty bleak. I just finished a book called, I think it's called The Long View, and it's this incredible book about China. And it was about these different Chinese scholars. Their most likely outcome for the United States is in the next 50 years. We are an English-speaking version of Latin America. Our inner cities are dead. Everyone lives in these very wealthy gated communities around the cities, and our economy is based on resource extraction, primarily sending China food and minerals. And their theory is if they wait long enough, you know, they're 50 years, we are well on our way to doing that to ourselves. So some other statistics I'll give you that I was looking at that are kind of interesting. And this is Pew Charitable Trust. They did a poll recently where they asked different generations to solve, what's better to solve problem, government or business and individuals? The boomer generation said 49% said government. My generation, Generation X, 53% said government. Generation Z, 70%. So you probably don't have that much. If we are invested in this republic and invested in the stability of the system and invested in the blessings of personal liberty and economic freedom, we are starting to run out of time here before there's going to be a missed opportunity to even educate those younger Americans on why these systems are positive and why they're so valuable. And by the way, Generation Z made up 10% of the last election. One of the fastest growing demographics electorally. So history. I like to think I can speak on authority about history because I spent one whole year teaching it. When I was in graduate school, I needed a job. My parents were those rude people who said, now that you got your undergraduate degree, like, do not expect any help coming from us. So to pay for my rent and to pay for grad school, I got a job teaching history. And it was a crazy experience because I literally started walking door to door to different schools in DC like, hey, you interested in hiring a guy who just wants to teach history because I read a lot? And I actually walked in and a principal actually said, you are a gift to come here today because our history teacher just quit. We will give you the job as long as you promise to go get your teaching certificate because I can't hire you unless you are in process of getting it. And so I said, yeah, I'm definitely getting my teaching certificate. And then she said, just by the way, no matter what you do, I will have to let you go at the end of the year. But I ended up winning Teacher of the Year that year. So here's how I taught history. I was given this history book that they gave all the students. And if you were trying to make an incredible history like the United States boring and irrelevant, you couldn't have done a better job in this textbook. It was mind-numbingly boring. And so I realized, man, I got a problem here. So what I did is I went out and I was reading my own type of things. And then I realized, well, if I start showing the stuff I read, everyone's going to say, hey, you're trying to indoctrinate our kids. So I went and found this book called Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. It's like, okay, this is perfect. So here's how I taught history. You talk about the Civil War. So you would read Howard Zinn's very left-wing version. You would read the most boring accounts possible out of the textbook. And then you would read just readings that I would put together. And then the students, like, it became this big debate. Who's right? What's right? And all of a sudden history went from something that you just to like people were arguing with each other and debating like what was happening here? Why was this? What was the cause of that? And actually the other thing I did is I also went backwards. I started teaching that day. So this would have been like 1997. So like you're in the middle. I mean, like you got like the Monica Lewinsky stuff going on. I started there and went backwards. And so the first lesson I gave was go and interview 2 veterans. And they had to go and find 2 vets. And the best part about the assignment is everyone went and interviewed like 6. Because if you ever sat in like the VFW hall with a couple vets with like a pack of cigarettes and a beer, like you're going to get stories all night long and your eyes are going to be this big. And that's what happened to these young students. And then the assignment would be, okay, ask your parents where they were when Kennedy got shot. Talk to your grandparents about, World War, and we just went through and went backwards. And so the whole first half of the class that I would teach with these 3 other books was, who are Americans? And so the final was all about like who Americans are. And then the second half of the year was, now how did we get this way? And then we would go back. And I just felt that was a great way to teach history because everyone got so excited about it and so into it. And then also they understood their place in it. So when you start going back to start talking about our founders, it was a lot of conversation about what the founders' intent were that made us the way they were today. So I like to think the students I had understood that the blessings that we have are the material goods that we have, but also the blessings that we have today where you could go outside and protest, wherever you want. There's a reason we have these things. And it is at our own peril if we do away with that part of the system. So I mentioned I saw the Berlin Wall, fall. And I think for me, growing up as a kid in suburban Cleveland, that was really fascinating to see these people with like big, thick coats on, and everything was gray and everything was just stark and it looked like a different planet. So after I got fired being a high school teacher, I ended up going and I moved to, it's called the Jagiellonian University. It's one of the oldest universities in the world. It's where Copernicus did all his work. He's an alum of the same university. And while I was there, I wanted to study economics. I wanted to study that transition from socialism to the market economy. And what was so neat about being there at the time is there's a guy called Balcerovich who was the economics minister and was basically writing this stuff up. I could just go and see him, knock on the door, and you could start talking to these people about why and how they were doing some of the things that they were doing. And I think that gave me an insight and a passion for the market, like that, and that's where it kind of came from. But at the time also I was, was in a relationship, and I remember going to my girlfriend's house. I mean, it had a no joke outhouse. And I tell you what, Poland gets cold. And when it's late at night and you got to go and it's 2 degrees outside, outhouses are really awful. But other things that they would do, they would steal electricity. And you'd see her grandmother climbing up to like tapping into electric to steal it. And I'd be there, and all of a sudden there'd just be like a bomb that would go off in the house of all this energy in action. And that was when someone from the power company was in the neighborhood trying to figure out who's stealing electricity. And there's grandma climbing up to try and unplug the house. And some of the other experiences I had there were like, this is after everything, this is like almost 10 years. This is like 1998, 1999. The lines I still had to stand in. So to pay a bill, you got your bill, you'd carry cash to the post office where you'd hand them the thing after standing in line for a couple hours, and then they would stamp. Then you would take the stamped bill to whoever you were trying to pay to stand in line again, to hand them the stamped receipt. I spent a day or 2 of every month just paying my bills as a student. So I got to experience this firsthand of what this actually looked like. And what's amazing to me is I brought my wife back 2 years ago to Krakow. It's completely different. Completely different. It's beautiful. All the cars are new. All the clothes are new. The restaurants are all open. And it's just this amazing blessing of what happens when you have an open political system and free markets and they come together. But there was a little hint of sadness talking to some of the people. Maybe it was my bad Polish, but it was also just in the conversations we'd have. A lot of the young people there, there's like there's almost a nostalgia for what they grew up with. They remember back these really bad Soviet cars, and even there, the whole thing of the concept of socialism just seems like something weird in the past. So I say that as we're talking about history, as we're talking about saving a republic, it's important to remember, that so many of the people that we're trying to talk to about this have no recollection of what these words mean. And so this is part of an education opportunity. It's one of the reasons I wrote this book, is so that I hope you all like it, but what I really hope is you grab extra copies and give it to younger people in your life and other people who are kind of wishy-washy, like, I kind of want to be involved in politics now and all. I tried to illustrate why, like, you go back through all of this, all these experiences I've had are the reason why I'm so passionate about, you have to save the republic. You have to save the structure. Actually, can I tell 2 Soviet jokes before I move on? All right. So there's this, these 2 people are standing in line for bread, and they're just standing there and standing there. And finally, this guy's like, that's it. I'm going to go shoot Brezhnev. Gets out and walks away. So the other guy's standing there smoking a cigarette. The guy comes back like 4 hours later. He's like, I thought you were going to go shoot Brezhnev. He's like, the line was so long. And by the way, all my jokes revolve around standing in line for bread. So this guy was standing in line for bread, and he throws his hands up. I can't believe this. Standing in line for bread yet again. And this guy gets this like little finger gun out and it's like, hey, I'm KGB. You remember what we used to do to people like you when they'd say that. And the guy gets all frazzled and goes home to his wife. She's like, what's wrong? What's wrong? Here's some vodka. What's wrong? It's so bad. It is getting so bad out there. She's like, what? What happened? No bread? He's like, yeah, no bread. But even worse, no bullets. So fast forward a little bit to, so some of the challenges that we face. Okay, so I talked about, a little bit of the threat of to the republic, a little bit of the threat that you have to not teaching history. The other threat that I see out there is you hear a lot about this, the phrase talking about the swamp. So first, before we all bemoan the swamp, let me just define how I see what the swamp is. And most importantly, we do have a swamp in Washington, D.C., but you've got a swamp in Harrisburg. You've actually got a swamp here in Philadelphia. And you even have a swamp at every school board that's around. And because usually I see 5 different creatures in the swamp. So it all starts off with the politician. Start with the politician. And then generally there is a lobbyist or an ex-politician that has a relationship with that politician. Very close, right? Very close. And then the media. And I don't want to disparage anyone in the media. I mean, I have a talk show now that I'm doing, so I guess technically I'm in the media myself. But what I notice happens is that media person, some of their self-esteem is based on having these relationships with these politicians. And I guarantee you, if any of these New York Times reporters, any other major reporter, they love the fact when they can call like Nancy Pelosi right now, then brag to their friends, like, I was just talking to Nancy Pelosi. It's part of who they are. It's part of their identity. Then you've got the regulators, who they need their jobs for the politicians. And then finally, there's usually these critters that circle around that are the political class. And what I mean, these are the folks that, the politicians need for reelection. And, oh, gee, we didn't win. We just spent $5 million, but we'll get them next time. And I'll get my cut of that again. So those 5 things kind of work together. In almost every single city I go to, there's a variation of the swamp. And be very clear, the reason we have, $30+ trillion in debt, the swamp is very bipartisan. And when you go through DC, it's like, when you are in office, there may be some partisanship, but when you graduate, we call it K Street, and you go there, it becomes distinctly very, very, very collegial. And their incentives, and you think about their incentives are to work together. And so, but there is a couple ways that you short circuit the swamp. So I guess it's like, let's go through what I've talked about right now, because this is generally the point where you say, okay, well, I thought your book says you're kind of optimistic. We've talked about, the swamp is hard to beat. We've talked about how our younger generations are not being educated, and where's the optimism here? And I go back to and I'm going to wrap up here soon so we can start taking questions. So you can get your question going now. But you remember the Congressman Mick Mulvaney, he was the chief of staff for a little while. He gave a quote that I don't think he meant to be public, but it was such a good quote. So he said there is 3 rules in his office. If you were a lobbyist and you showed up and you wanted a meeting, but you didn't give, see you later. If you were a lobbyist and you donated, you'll definitely meet a staffer. Maybe you would meet with Mick Mulvaney. But if you were a constituent and you showed up in that office, their rules will pull him out of any meeting. In my experience in politics has been that when people say politicians don't listen, if the absolute opposite is true, these are some of the most like self-centered, fickle people in the world. These people want this attention and they crave it. And I remember there's been in a car with a very well-named senator. As soon as he gets in the car, he gets his phone out and he just starts checking Twitter mentions. The first thing. So if you actually, this is the brilliance of our system. This is how you save it. It's just, you've got to get involved. And I know many people in this room think, well, I write checks. Okay, that's great. But you have the right to pick up your phone and call your senator and call your congressman and call your board, your school board, and people just don't do that. So who does? The other side does. And then the results are predictable. So why is Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin not going along with these bills right now? I could guarantee you it's the sheer number of calls and the pressure they're getting back home. Incentives matter. So if you take that time, if you're curious about what kids are being taught in your local area, what we try and do in our organization is try and lower those boundaries so you know what it's like to show up to a school board meeting, what questions you can ask, how you can participate. Call your congressman, call your senator's office. It does make a difference. If you've got an extra hour, go and visit their local office. Here's the secret. They have offices in DC. They all have district offices. There is a district office near you. There's a few things that would be more powerful for you to do if you didn't like something that's happening in Washington than to show up, say, hey, I vote in your district and I oppose this. Or, I vote in your district and thank you very much, Congressman or Congresswoman, for doing what you did. That stuff immediately gets filtered back to these folks. And so it doesn't, your governor, whatever, the more you get involved and try and drag a few of your friends and family along with you, at the end of the day, that is just about the only way you're going to be able to, when I look at the long-term threats facing our system, it really does come down to people in this room. Does your friends and family, do they get more involved in the system? Because if you do, that is our way forward to save it. So with that, I can't wait for questions.
Adam, thank you. That was wonderful. I'm going to ask the first question. Without being a boring history teacher, you talked about democracy and what it is, majority rules. You talked about the threat of that, but talk about a republic and what are the safeguards built into our system. I'll go through the three top ones off the top of my head. Federalism, representative government, electoral college. These are things that I think are under threat right now. How do they help create a republic?
Well, the first thing I just got to start with, you meant, federalism. The more that the power shifts to the executive branch, it goes from to the executive branch, the president, right to the bureaucracies. And the more that grows, that is such a massive threat to our system. And remember that because the swamp power system kind of revolves around that now. And there's a reason why housing values are rising so fast in DC and why incomes are rising so fast in DC. So the only way that federalism works is if Congress and the Senate decide to pull that power back and check federal power. And again, the way that they do that is if they know that their constituents want that power pulled back, that will happen. When it comes to the Electoral College, I don't know if it's going to make it, to be honest. And I'll tell you why. In the last election, Colorado voted, and it was passed overwhelmingly, that in the state of Colorado, it doesn't matter where the state goes, they are now going to pledge their electors to popular vote. Colorado passed it. That's law. Could it be challenged? Who knows? Who knows? But what I do know as time goes on, I think more and more states are going to start to pick that up. So in my mind, in my job, I'm already there. If you're thinking about politics and especially presidential politics, your goal absolutely has to be to win the popular vote, period. And I could go into, it's actually, when you look at some of the gains that have been made in industrial states, and you look at some of the gains specifically amongst Hispanic Americans, my folks, I think there's actually a bright future for winning the popular vote. There was one, and then the other, right? Well, so, but, so the threat to me, again, it just all goes back to if you make it an issue and people respond to it, but it's also holding them accountable in how they're voting. And one of the sneaky things that happens that a politician will do is they will say, okay, I support the Clean Air Act, but then they'll delegate to the EPA, please do things for clean air, but they don't kind of detail what those things are. And so they've got this great out then when someone shows up to their office and it's like, hey, you just shut down the steel mill in our area. He's like, well, I didn't vote for that. You know, I just told him I wanted clean air. So, but then on the other side, they could say they voted for that. At the end of the day, all that power is just moving. There's a bill called the REINS Act that I love that's been kicking around in the Senate for years. And it would be, if there is $100 million or more in economic impact, it has to be voted on. Because that is what a congressman or senator hates the most, is putting their record down.
Adam, I've sort of lost faith in politicians to change anything. I think the problems that are driving America are more economic. And I look at the wealth gap, and wealth gap is creating an entire class of people who don't choose to be stakeholders in our society anymore because they can't attain it. I'd like you to address that from your perspective.
So this is the wealth gap. I think one of the biggest problems you start to have is I kind of look at more as the meritocracy gap, where when I look, as long as everyone knows they've got a fair shake in the country, I think that you can start to bridge a lot of that problem. And to me, that starts with the schools. And this is why I'm such a defender of parental choice with education, because as long as everyone has the shot at a great education, that should take away. It doesn't matter if everyone has the same shot at an education, outcomes later on in life aren't as important. But the other side of that problem that I see, and we've been experimenting with universal basic income in the last couple of years here, all these trillions of dollars that we're spending. And shockingly, when you pay people to stay home, they do. And we've kind of reached over a point now where your average recipient is getting over $25,000 when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to food, when it comes to housing. And I think one of the saddest parts of our country is what happens then is we get stuck into multi-generational poverty. And this is all regions, all races, all areas. I was at a clinic out in the middle of nowhere, Oregon. And it just struck me because this one center was trying to get people to work. And it was a lot of the people who were there were like 25-year-old males who have never had a job in their life. And again, if you get to a situation where you make $50,000 or less and it's just cheaper and easier for you to stay home, what you do. So, and that, to me, that does go back to these elections do matter. And one thing I've got to say about the last election, and this is what gives me a lot of hope going forward from my perspective, it is still very much a center-right country. My guys were supposed to get completely wiped out. We almost got the House of Representatives. We took state houses. We expanded at the state level. And that is because the country is still a center-right nation. So I do think we do have threats that we are facing, particularly as if you get more people, and this is my concerns with a lot of mail-in voting, is that part of HR 1, this bill that was moving in the Senate, said if you were on a government program, they would automatically register you and send you a ballot. And I think that's a hell of an incentive to be on a government system and get a government ballot. Like, gee, I wonder what you're going to be voting for. So I look at, there is legislative things we need to do. One thing that is over, and this is where I'll wrap up this question, one thing is incredibly popular polling. If you talk to people about changing welfare and how it's done in the United States, this is a bipartisan issue. Everyone agrees that the way we do welfare is wrong. And I think that the experiment with universal basic income with no one working, and just talk to any small business owner or anyone trying to go get a beer anywhere in America, and they will tell you it didn't work.
Questions?
With a federal workforce of 2 million people and the vast majority of rules being made by the federal executive branch, is it really true to say it's still a republic?
Ooh, is it true to say it's still a republic? We are not nearly as much of a republic as we were when we were founded, period. And you look at a lot of the weakening, you go back to in the early 1900s when we did direct election of US senators, that really, when you started doing that instead of state reps doing that, the effect of it, and I understand it sounds great to do that, but the effect of it was weakening the power of the states vis-a-vis the federal government. And then generally every single time you have a war, you have a massive centralization. And then what we're going through right now is we're going through another wave that is on par with the Great Society and with the New Deal that is trying to be pushed through this reconciliation process. So I could spend all day going through some of the problems, but at the end of the day, the fact that the citizen still has so much power in our system, the fact that as long as we still hold the filibuster, that you still have that Senate check, that to me shows that we may not be as much of a republic as we once were, but we've got plenty to build on. And if in the last election, and I'm just saying Republicans and Democrats here, it's interesting, if 90,000 people would have voted, more people would have voted for Republicans, they would have had in different districts, the House, the Senate, and the White House. 90,000 votes is really what separated the current outcome from that outcome. So what that tells me is like everyone needs to be involved, and if people are concerned about these issues and they get involved in the system, we have plenty of time and space to pull this back. My concern is if we go a few more elections without being worried about this, you could get into a situation where maybe it does become too far gone and you do become this weird direct democracy that is guaranteeing everyone for everything. And you know, that always ends in tyranny, unfortunately.
Adam, I like the fact that you're optimistic in the long run,
Yeah.
but what you did mention is you have to win the popular vote. And obviously you mentioned demographics are changing very rapidly. How do you make the party that's more focused on liberty a bigger tent to draw in that popular vote? It's got to get there somehow. What are some of the ways you think that can happen in your optimistic view?
Well, but when I look at how particularly Hispanic America, I think that there was a major miscalculation on both political parties that Hispanics will end up voting just the same way as Black America has. And this misunderstanding that when you talk to people who are Hispanic, it is an incredibly varied experience. Cubans are different from Venezuelans, different from Mexicans. First generations are second generations. People who are Hispanic can't even agree on what Hispanic is. It's such a diverse group. But I go back to one of my first experiences in college when I went to Denver. I went to a rodeo and I went to go get some drinks. And as I'm coming back from the rodeo, I'm walking past the Ford exhibit and had all the big F-150s, and who's there? These really tough macho guys with these, you know, cowboy hats, big belt buckles, you know, and you know, they had it was this just awesome. It was like the Marlboro Man himself, with like 50 of them looking at these trucks. Not one of them spoke English. Not one of them. And then, I look at the election results, and you know, at the presidential level, you had a big shift that happened in 2016, but in the last election, 8% more of those folks voted Republican than Democrat. That is in political. I mean, normally you see like 1.2% move, and you're like, wow, look at that. That dial's really going. 8% shift, and this is an 8% shift in our fastest growing states with our fastest growing part of the population. So I can't tell you I fully understand what happened there, because we've been doing a lot of studies to try and figure this out, doing a lot of different, but one thing we did that was fascinating, what is the number one issue? It doesn't matter what Hispanic group you came from, what's the number one issue that you care about? Education. Education. And what do these folks want? They want their kids to, and as I like to say, they want their kids to be job ready. This is the biggest opportunity for small government people ever, is to go to that community and say, look, you work with us, we're going to give you the opportunity. So even if you don't necessarily want your kid to go to college, you want them to be able to go and get a technical skill. I mean, have any of you tried to get a heating and person to your house for, you know, there's so much opportunity. And I think right there, that was the only demographic that you worked at, that would be enough in the long run. And then where I come from, I think what's interesting, and the forward of my book, it's one of those weird paths of life. I became friends with Nigel Farage and in Britain. And I just thought it was, because I was very interesting how he used Grassroots. And so I started talking with him. And they won over a lot of traditional deep blue labor in Britain for what he was doing. And I asked him, well, what was the issue? And he's like, it was cultural. And as soon as I'm like, well, gay marriage and abortion, cultural? It's like, no, pride in Britain. Like, think about it. These people's parents and grandparents, what they sacrificed to get through in World War II, they still remember what their grandparents did in World War I. They are very proud of being British. And when there's movements to remove Winston Churchill from British schools, you piss these people off. And I think there's a similar thing happening in this country where where I grew up in Cleveland, I would take this as a huge compliment. Philadelphia does remind me of some of the stuff I grew up with in Cleveland, that you have this blue collar ethic. You've got this, kind of this toughness to yourself, this great storied history of these incredible diverse backgrounds that come to make your great city. And you think about that, there's a lot of pride there. And I think that stretches across Pennsylvania, it stretches through Ohio, it stretches through Michigan, it stretches, I think, all the way up into Minnesota. And so I think there's another group of Americans that I think almost every issue, even economics, have now become cultural. And I think there's a certain amount of enough is enough. Like we have a lot of stains on our history. There's no doubt about that. Every country does. But when you look at what we're trying to do together and moving forward, that's what you kind of inspire people together on. And this is why I also think when you start breaking people up into their sub-economic and ethnic groups, it's very dangerous for a republic. This is the most successful multi-ethnic country in world history. With the Roman Empire, was that a nice place to live in the Roman Empire? Is Brazil great? And you look, China's doing its absolute best to get rid of everyone who is non-Han Chinese. Like, this is an incredible thing that we've got here. And I think that demographically in the long run, it's up to us to make that case. And by the way, I don't want to be dramatic here, but if we don't get this right and we do slide into a democracy and this all starts to happen, what's the lesson for history going forward? Multi-ethnic states don't work. 100 years from now, if we get this wrong, I think what that means, it's not good. We have to get this right. We have to save the republic system.
I think we have time for one more question. Christian?
My question has to do with the media. You've given us insight as to how to become more active with our government representatives. But how can we bring the message of the republic point of view more forcefully and more comprehensively into the public media?
Well, I don't know if you can. There's two ways I think that you do it. When you interview Americans on who they trust, the media is one of the least trusted institutions of all. But who Americans trust? Each other. Americans trust their neighbors. Americans trust their family. So I am not advertising you be that person at Thanksgiving. It's like, okay, clear the table now. Let's talk about the republic, damn it. I'm not saying that, but in your personal lives, there are those opportunities to have conversations. Like, I try to do it on the sly with my nephews. And I think there's also just this, I like to ask basic questions to folks rather than trying to, beat them down with like, it's a Republican if you do it away. You just start asking questions of like, well, would you support a system that minorities no longer have rights? Well, no, I wouldn't do that. Well, that's the problem if you go to a full democracy. It's just starting to have those conversations in our personal lives. And this is what I'm going to say next is usually we're going to get all the blowback in the world. We do have a huge opportunity on social media. That is the main way that FreedomWorks uses to communicate to people. And with all the problems that Facebook has, it's still our most active community by far, by far. And you are able to go around the CNNs and the rest of them with that. And the other thing I always say is like because people trust their neighbors, I'm not asking you to basically it goes down to if you put hardcore Biden or hardcore Trump content, no one is going to listen to you. Like those two things, everyone tunes out. It's the next layer down. We start asking other questions about, is this the right way to do things? Or even just asking, is this policy working? There's so many people who can't even find, we have all these people who are getting paid to stay home, yet there's no jobs. I mean, posting things like that is incredibly powerful. It's incredibly powerful, but you can be the best evangelist for, if you believe this is a republic, you yourself are the best people to carry that message forward.
Adam Brandon, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Adam Brandon, thank you, Adam, for being with us. Yes, we have, Adam has books out here that are free to everyone in attendance, and he's happy to sign them. So please come back and talk to Brandon, have a book signed. We will see you next Wednesday with Jordan Sokol, the artist who painted